Hi loves, welcome back to the channel. My name is Victoria and in today's video we'll be making a satin slip skirt with an elastic waistband. So I'll be using a pattern to draft out the skirt, but you can work directly on your fabric. The only reason I'm working with a pattern is because I want to make this in other colors. At the top of my pattern paper, I drew out my start line, which will also be my waistline. While at the bottom of the pattern paper, I drew out my hemline plus 1 inch for hemming allowance. Now for the full length of the skirt, I decided to go with 31 inches plus 1 inch for hemming allowance. That's 32 inches in total. So you decide how long you want yours to be. Now this edge right here will serve as my center front and center back, and it will be cut on a fold. So I'm just indicating that, after which I'll be moving on to mark the rest of my measurements. And the first measurement I'll be taking here is my waist to hip measurement at 8.5 inches. I'll go on to mark that point across, then bring in my ruler to square it out, and that line will become my hip line. So that's it. And now that I have these lines, I'll move on to mark a quarter of my horizontal measurements, and I'll be starting with my waistline. So on the waistline, I'm marking a quarter of my waist circumference plus 1 inch. Now the reason I added 1 inch to my waist measurement is because this skirt won't have a zipper. I'll be adding an elastic band to the waistline, but I still need it to pass through the hip. So yeah, now I'll move on to mark a quarter of my hip circumference along the hip line. And after marking that point, I'll be bringing in my pattern master to connect the waistline to the hip line. Now for the hemline, you can decide to add 2 to 4 inches to the measurement you have on the hip line, depending on how wide you want the skirt to be. For me, I decided to go with 3 inches, so I have 11 inches along the hip line. Adding 3 inches to that gives me 14, so I'm marking 14 inches along the hemline. Now after marking that point, I'll be bringing in my straight ruler to connect the hip line to the hemline. I'll also be extending it further to meet the hemming allowance. I forgot to do that earlier. So now, because this skirt is like an A-line skirt, I'm going to be covering the sides to meet the hemline. So on this side here, I'll be coming up from the hemline by half an inch. I'll mark that point and do the same for the hemming allowance. After which, I'll find the midpoint of the hemline. I'll mark that point and do the same for the allowance before bringing in my pattern master to connect these points to the points I marked along the sides in a curve. Now when I'm done with the hem, I'm moving back to the waistline, and what I'm going to do is to depress the waistline so it sits better on my waist. So from the waistline, I came down by 0.75 along the center front. Now I'll bring in my pattern master and connect that point back into the original waistline. So the first curve I made was too deep. Now I'm just going back in again to make it a bit shallower. And that's it for this skirt pattern. So I cancelled out the first curve so that I don't get confused, and now I'll just go on to add my seam allowances. For the seam allowance, I'll be using half an inch along the waistline and half an inch along the sides. Remember, I already added my hemming allowance when drafting out the pattern, so I only have to add allowance to the waistline and the sides. So after coming up by half an inch along the waistline, I'll be going in with my pattern master to connect those points together. Then I'll cancel out the original waistline and indicate my new waistline. I'll go on to mark out half an inch along the sides, then go in with my rulers to connect all the points together following the main pattern. So this is it. Here's what we have. What's left to do is to go in with my scissors and cut along the lines that I've marked. So this is a pattern that I'll be using to cut onto fabric, and I'll be cutting on a bias with this pattern. So I folded my fabric on a bias and placed the pattern on top, making sure that the center front of the pattern is on the folded end of the fabric. So now I'm just going in with my scissors to cut out the front piece using the pattern. And when I'm done with that, I'll be using the front piece to cut out the back. So now I've placed the front piece to the rest of the fabric, making sure the folded ends are aligned. And now I'm just raising the waistline for the back piece by 0.75. This is so it sits properly on my bum. So from 0.75, I cut in a slant to meet the side of the front piece so they can match. Then I went on to cut out the rest exactly as the front piece. I also went on to notch the center front and center back, as this will come in handy when it's time to attach the elastic. I also made a notch on the hip line so when stitching I can match the front and back piece properly. So this is the front piece with the right side facing up. I'm going to place the back piece on top of this, right sides facing each other. I'll go on to pin this together so it stays in place. and then move on to match the notches I have along the hip line, so that when I take this to the machine, I'll just run a straight stitch from the waist all the way down to the hem using a 0.5-inch sewing allowance, and I'll do the same for the other side as well. So after stitching down the sides, here's what we have. Now I simply have to attach the elastic to the waistline. Now I'll be using a 1-inch wide elastic, which measures my waist circumference minus 2.5 inches. And I'll just take this to the machine and run a zigzag stitch to hold it together. So after doing that, here's what we have. You can see the stitch right there. Now before attaching this to the waistline of the skirt, I'll go ahead to mark it in quarters so I know exactly where to pin it down on the skirt before stitching. So after making my markings on the elastic, I'll be bringing in the skirt and pass it through the elastic like this. You can see this is the right side of the skirt. So now I'm going to be pinning the stitch on the elastic to the center back of the skirt. Then I'll go on to match the markings I made on the elastic to either side of the skirt and also to the center front. So now I'll take this to the machine and flip it over to the wrong side. And I'll stitch the elastic to the skirt using a zigzag stitch. So when stitching this, you realize the elastic is much shorter than the waistline of the skirt. That's okay, just pull on the elastic as you go so it matches the skirt. So I've attached the elastic to the skirt and this is how it's looking. I used a zigzag stitch for that, but you can use a straight stitch as well. Now I'm going to give this skirt a good press and then fold the elastic in towards the wrong side. Then I'll hand stitch the elastic to the side seam of either side of the skirt, making sure the seam doesn't appear on the right side of the skirt. And after doing all that, here's what we have. So you can see I stitched the elastic to the skirt along the sides just like I said I would. And now all that's left to do is to finish off the hem, and I decided I'll be overlocking it. But I'll be doing that later because I don't have an overlocker with me. So yeah, that's it for this satin slip skirt tutorial. It was very easy, simple, straightforward, and now that I have a pattern, I'll be making one in every color. Let me know in the comments if you want to see a tutorial of this skirt with a side zipper instead of an elastic band. And yeah, that's it. We've come to the end of this tutorial. If you stayed to the end, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll be seeing you in my next video.